is a different kind of conviction that's coming from the people who spoke with you. And it's manifested in something that I think could be well called social democracy, which is an extension certainly of John Dewey's work. So when you hear words like community and democracy and equality and compassion, they're embedded in the political system here, even in the form of a political party. And one party runs for office on a platform of equality, not equal opportunity, but equality. And the sorts of social justice activities that the BCTF engages in, for which they spend $1 million a year of their own dues money, spreading democracy and human freedom around the world, not just in Canada or in North America, that motivation is also coming from a spiritual place which is more present here in Canada. I can say as an American who's become a Canadian citizen, it's more present, and it's a lesson that could well be learned by our large neighbor to the south, by my native land, America. So I'm trying to get you to hear with bigger ears, because there is something different to Canada. It's something which is present in much of the developed world throughout Northern Europe, and that's called social democracy. So these words like community, democracy, equality, compassion, human autonomy, they have real meaning here. They're not buzzwords. They're not created by Frank Luntz and Karl Rove or Fox News. They're words and concepts that people put their lives and careers on the line over. There is a job action going on right now which could bankrupt the Teachers Federation. There was a 2-week closing of the schools in 2005 in which families and parents sided with the teachers and prevailed against the government. So there is something different in Canada. There's something very precious. It's not different from Northern Europe or Scandinavia, but it's very different from the United States. And I hope that as you spend your time here in Vancouver at this conference, you're able to take away from this some glimmer of what I think is best called social democracy, something that is not represented by a political party in the United States, and which has been almost moribund since the days of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society.
Good morning. My name is David Hansen from Teachers College in New York City. I wanted to share a comment with you, and maybe you'll have a comment on the comment. And that was, I was particularly struck, Kip, by your comments about the need to remember our history, the need to remember that teaching has a history. It's a practice with a rich background, a rich tradition, and the ways that I thought linked up so nicely, Marjorie, with your introduction and your accent on tradition and heritage and roots in the very lovely way I think you echoed that and represented that. And it seems to me, I mean, I really resonate with a theme that I heard in all three of your comments, that one of the things we can do as teachers is to insist on our story, insist on the idea that teaching is a practice, is a profession, that teachers believe in broadening and deepening and enriching students' lives. And that is a different, I think as you said, Kip, it's a different story than what we hear from some of the other entities participating in education. It's a different narrative, it's a different description, and somehow we have to just keep working on our descriptions. So it's just a comment. I mean, I really take heart from what you're trying to do and so support it, and I hope we can import some of that spirit south.
I think what we have to rediscover through our history is talking about the purpose of public education, because that purpose has changed and we've forgotten, and we have to remember.
I just wanted to respond to one of the most important things in my culture, again, have been instilled in me since I can ever remember, is the stories that need to be shared. Because if we don't know our history and we don't know where we're at today, we cannot go into the future. And whatever has been, any of the events that have happened in history, we need to share that, because if it's something that's lessons that we need to learn from, it will be repeated again if we don't share our stories. It doesn't matter what kind of stories, we always need to share that. That sharing is so important about any of the historical events. And history is so important because we cannot have it happen again if it's detrimental to our students and our communities.
Eric Sheffield from Missouri State University. I think this would be for Joanna. Is that? And it has a little bit to do with history and exporting and importing. I'm kind of curious about the recent history here relative to what sounds like a shift, and how much of that has been exported, as in No Child Left Behind and all of that, and are they similar? They sound very similar. So just some history and a comment on that.
Well, that's something that we've certainly been struggling here with for a long time, and there has been a shift. And I actually grew up in Ontario, so I've lived here since the late 90s. So, that's sort of the frame that I have. But I know certainly when I moved here and pre that time, there was much more autonomy in how teachers worked in their classroom. And I was actually a special ed teacher at the time, and I spent one afternoon a week doing paperwork, and the rest of my job was actually working with students. Now that's shifted almost to the complete reverse in that time frame that I mentioned. And this is just one example. And it's because of all the testing and all the, the red tape and the paperwork, with all the stuff that I always think of in the No Child Left Behind policy from the States. The current government that we've had came in, was it 2001? I think when they were elected, 2001. And they've really followed that model, the accountability and the testing agenda. We have many roots, I think, closer to some of the ideology in the Scandinavian countries, and I think in Canada we tend to take for granted that that's sort of the system that we have, this sort of collective responsibility for people. And somehow this accountability and the testing agenda, we keep looking to the States, even though we watch, and I apologize to anyone, but we sort of watch your system crumbling away, and that's the model that our government looks to in terms of our education policy, rather than the successful stories in Scandinavian countries, right? We talk a lot about Finland here in British Columbia, and so that's sort of what we are fighting back against, but hopefully that answered it a little bit.
Jim Garrison. A question, I guess, to shift us to maybe more the micropolitics or the classroom side. Increasingly, as I talk to people, throughout the world, except perhaps for countries with reindeer in them, increasingly the ends of teachers are being pre-specified and then narrowed. In the most narrow sense, test scores. I can sum it all up. The whole aim of education, our teaching, is test scores. Likewise, increasingly, the means are being specified and then narrowed. It's certainly in the United States, but elsewhere, it's evidence-based research on the medical model. And yet, for generations, teachers in their classrooms have decoupled from systems and have managed to engage in creative practice. From your perspective as practitioners, is that its possibilities narrowing, or can you still, in fact, close the door and teach creatively and uniquely from the ordinary, everyday perspective? Do you understand my question? Is it still room to decouple from these systems and teach in the creative ways you want, or is the specification becoming so narrow and so controlling that you cannot do that anymore, or it's getting too hard to do?
I believe it's getting more and more difficult to do that, but I think we have to aspire to do that no matter what. I like to remind teachers that if the measures are narrow enough, class size doesn't matter, right? The opposing narrative to me is about succeeding while failing, right? How to succeed at failing. So I think we have to acknowledge that it is a system of control, and with that knowledge, then we're better able to go into our classroom and teach a broad-based education with that purpose in mind, and not be slaves to the narrow measures that you talk about.
I have a comment, actually. I'm Wendy Poole. I'm with the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. And I think it's important to add a couple other things to the discussion, because it has a lot to do with issues around democracy. One of them is the fact that in 2002, the government passed legislation that enabled school districts to create school district business companies. So that some school districts, not all of them have engaged in this practice, but some of them have both a public side and they have a private side. And the purpose of that private side is to generate revenue from private sources in order to help fund the public side of their organizations. And there's, that raises some serious concerns for me around, well, what are the ethics of that? How is the use of private funds in schools going to impact equity? And something that's very recent here in the Lower Mainland anyway has been a trend towards large corporations treating schools, viewing schools as charitable organizations. Schools are beginning to cry out through letters to the editor saying, you know, we're so strapped for cash and our kids are coming to school not properly dressed, holes in their shoes, hungry, etc. And what has happened is that some large corporations have said, aha, here's a great opportunity. They are making donations, charitable donations to schools, which sounds very benign. However, again, it's an opportunity for the private sector to get more involved in schools, and what kinds of influences might that have down the road? Is that money going to come with strings attached? So I just wanted to add those two things.
My name is Molly. I'm from Atlanta, and I work in an area where the neoliberal policy is very active. I'm concerned, though, that the funding from the private sector is really what is saving my community. You spoke of broken spirits. Our public education has lost accreditation. I'm not sure if you understand what I mean by that, but it's a big deal. Several of the counties have lost it, and the public funding is just not there. The way that schools are funded is very different, and our community happens to be neglected from an academic sense, from an economic sense, from every perspective. And people are going the private route where they're actually a little bit more encouraged by private dollars regardless of who's giving it, because that's where they seem to see success, whether that be in test scores or whether that be in their children's behavior. Things like the Kip schools, no affiliation, things like the Kip schools and things like that have somewhat saved children in our communities. Some of the military schools, the charter schools, things like that are starting to take over. If we're really concerned, though, I think that we have to start looking more at the politics of how we engage our educators to participate in things like this, is which we don't, the teacher education programs don't invite anyone to come and chit-chat in the classes. And as we've said, it's gotten more to the methodology side, and there's very little of the foundations. As a matter of fact, I think one of my classes, probably the last classes that we really had, is serious foundations of education, just one course, you know. I'm concerned, though, that if we fight the neoliberal and the public is broken, what about those broken spirited people, which is a huge population, and that's where we're getting all of these dilemmas that are becoming very public. I'm not sure if you all know about our big issues in the U.S. about Trayvon Martin and things like that. All of that ties, for me, back to the foundations of education. I just wondered if, especially Marjorie, if you had something to say in reference to that.
Well, my heart goes out to Trayvon and his family. The broken spirits. It's, we're Aboriginal people in BC and in Canada. Our spirits have been broken since contact, and no disregard to people who have come here. But the oppression, the assimilation tactics that the government has had on our people has really damaged our spirits. But you know what is really pulling us through? Our culture. our culture is still alive and well. I just came back from my community from the north, and we've had, unfortunately, 2 deaths in our community, and both of them are very close to my family. And in my culture, we have potlatches, which is my government. This is what I grew up with. So we had our potlatches both days, one after another, and I kept thinking, how did I manage to keep my spirit intact even though it's been chipped away and cracked? And how did I manage? A lot of people say, why are you in a situation that you're in with the Federation, with teaching, with where you live? I'm very privileged. Mind you, not as privileged as some individuals, but I have been able to succeed in this Western way of being. I just keep thinking, how did I manage? And I keep going back to the teachings, I keep going back to my grandparents, and they kept our culture. They kept instilling that culture, at the same time trying to say, you know what, in order to be successful in today's world, I need to also learn how to, I hate to say it, but compromise some of my identity to be where I am today. And so how do we make our 2 worlds go like this rather than this way, and keep damaging each other? And so that keeps coming up for me, and my answer always to many people is to connect to the roots is so important. Connect to who you are and where you come from. That's what's going to pull Indigenous peoples anywhere, because that protocol is so important of identity, of self-esteem, of who you are, where you belong, a sense of belonging. So that helps the spirit. And even though we've been attacked so long with all of the assimilation and oppression, our people are thriving despite that damaged spirit. And I have to say we've had damaged spirits, because I cannot sugarcoat it and say we're all fine, because we're not all fine. We're still healing, and it's going to take a lot of people helping us through that healing process. Ally building is so important, and I'm so honored and privileged to have been able to speak to you and to encourage all of you to work together. We need to come together. We need to fight the fight together, because we have so many similar issues, so many similar concerns. I don't know if I answered that.
Oh, I think you did. You know, to feature one thing that Marjorie said, the concept of identity and how you choose to construct your identity, I think is a key theme that was coming out here. And whether you choose to make it something like the community of people you work with, or your profession, or the community of humanity, or whether you choose to make it gun rights, or a particular cult of a religion that's exclusionary to other people. That idea of identity, I think, is one of these spiritual concepts, psychological concepts that isn't surfaced consciously enough anywhere in the world, and especially in North America. And as a result, we get people having their identities manipulated by advertising and political advantage, and we end up in a conflictive situation that we can't get out of because of that. Now, let's change pace and let you go off into 3 groups and come back, and then we'll wrap things up and hear what you said in smaller groups.
Hello, I'm Greg Bistaff from Scotland. We had an interesting discussion, so I need to summarize it as I'm looking at my notes. We started by looking at the whole question of teachers' judgment, and not only the role of that, but also how that can be supported. And we looked at different elements of that. It needs to be supported by a discourse on the purposes of public education that is a different one from the one that is steering a lot of educational practice. There was also the question what needs to come before judgment, or what is the context in which judgment can be exercised, and what is the quality of the judgment that we need, because technical judgment is also judgment, but the question is how do you get to moral judgment, which then also raised a point at the very end where Joanna had spoken about fear, and in a sense to judge and act on your judgment also requires a certain courage. So how can you also foster courage in teacher education? That was one thing we looked at. We also spoke about the implications for teacher education, continuing education of teachers in induction programs beyond their initial education. And believe it or not, we spoke quite a lot about democracy. That a lot of these questions still come back to what is democracy, how is democracy enacted in schools, how do we enact democracy in our own higher education and teacher education practices. So those were some of the topics we had in our conversation.
I'm Debbie Seltzer from Southern Illinois University. And in our group, we began by talking about the role of foundations in education and the simultaneous question of whether teaching is or is not a political act. Because so often for classroom teachers, there's this tremendous overwhelm by the busyness of the classroom. So it's, I'm just teaching, you know, and then the later realization that in fact we're engaged in a deeply political business because we're facilitating certain kinds of interests. The questions that arose moved back and forth between the role of the union in facilitating communication and unity among teachers, and then back and forth between teachers, unions, and the wider public to help the public understand and to begin to counter some of the narratives that we're hearing from neoliberalism as it attempts to splinter and shatter the kinds of teacher concerns that we see expressed. As teacher educators, we discussed the need for preparing teachers to survive the system, understanding and redescribing the qualities that lead to burnout, helping teachers to find their own sense of the moral and the ethical and of the connection with their work and with one another, understanding what is dividing and conquering us, and turning some into conscientious objectors and leavers. We surfed across the question of fomenting subversion as well, so that we can help teachers to survive their environments. Questions of what does the union offer? And most of all, what we've heard over and over, I think, is a suggestion that there's a need for a reimagining of the role, that we can't ask teachers to merely collapse their differences, their plurality, and their interests into some blob, that's not the word that was used in the session, into some larger entity of the union, but also how does the union begin to reimagine itself as the role, as the spokesperson for all of this. And again, some of the relatively standard discussions that we have in foundations, the factory industrialization, the fact that we've had a factory modeled union system, these are all the sorts of questions and discussions that we moved through, and I think that was the, just some of the language, again, the language issues with neoliberalism and the ways in which we have to interact and perhaps reappropriate some of that language as we move to communicate among ourselves and with the public.
We spoke about parents and communities in our small breakout, and I think we had several interesting topics discussed that a little bit got off the topic, but we were focused on originally demystifying curriculum. There were some things that here in BC they were doing to bring in the community to help, I guess, understand the text. So we got into some of the things about the technicalities of how homework and how those things have worked. But I think more importantly, we got into a discussion about the voices that aren't heard in foundations of education classrooms, in the schools themselves. Generally, I think there was some comment about in British Columbia there was some schools that were bringing in community members, elders into the schools that helped advise teachers who were working within those regions that were able to help bridge gaps between the community and the educators. More so, though, in teacher education programs where it wasn't just an emphasis on making sure that future teachers get foundations of education classes, but more so that the voices of the community be heard within those communities. It depends on who's giving the class, and it depends on who's in the classroom, because the dialogue won't occur if you don't have enough diversity within the classroom itself. You're not going to get those types of contradictory statements. There just won't be the voice. We also discussed a little bit about teachers being viewed as parents. I think a lot of the times we might be perceived as people who don't necessarily have families. We're not wives, we're not parents, we're not children of someone else. That was a very important point. So I suppose, not making this, there's someone speaking during the conference about the invisible researcher, which I guess from our perspective in that particular group, there's no such thing, and that we need to be there. They need to know who we are. They need to know that we're parents, that we're wives, things like that. Husbands, sorry, gentlemen. Also, the community alliances, as far as the network itself, not necessarily face-to-face, just face-to-face networking, but also networking on a scale with community members that aren't necessarily just elders. I guess in the States we don't really have that issue so much unless we're working on a reservation, but more so with the community members. I mean, our local farmers, our local electricians, those kinds of voices need to be heard as well. I think those are the things that bring biology and chemistry to life, and those are the types of things that are absent as far as bringing community and parents and things like that into the discussion. I think we found that that's an important part, a critical component of it all.
We want to encourage you to go back to wherever you're from and invite more people to come next year and encourage membership in the John Dewey Society. Okay? Thank you very much.